From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The committee continues to look into all evidence to see if there was any hint of collusion.
As the Senate Intelligence Committee says it's reached the conclusion Russia interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, but it says it's still examining whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. We discuss Russia, Putin, and Trump with award-winning Russian-American author and journalist Masha Gessen.
Remember, Trump used to tell us that Putin called him brilliant? And what Putin actually said was that Trump was colorful. The word colorful in Russian can also be translated to English as bright, right? So someone must have translated for Trump as bright.
We'll also talk with Gessen about her new book, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, and has just been shortlisted for the National Book Award. Then President Trump said Tuesday his administration would help Puerto Rico wipe out its $73 billion debt to help it recover from the extensive damage caused by Hurricane Maria. His budget director then walked back those comments. We'll get response from Puerto Rican-born New York Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, who went to Puerto Rico with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo 2 days after the storm hit.
We need to make Puerto Rico whole again, and we will not rest until we achieve that. These are 3.5 million Americans. These are American citizens.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Puerto Rico, more than 90% of the island still does not have electricity from the power grid, and half the island does not have clean drinking water, now more than 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria. On Wednesday, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney, contradicted President Trump's comments about wiping out Puerto Rico's billion-dollar debt amidst the catastrophic aftermath of Hurricane Maria.
Dealing with the challenges that Puerto Rico had. The island is at least $72 billion in debt, 120 if you go by other counts, before the storm. We are going to focus our attention right now on rebuilding the island, repairing the island, making sure everybody is safe, and that we get through this difficult times. We are not going to deal right now with those fundamental difficulties that Puerto Rico had before the storm. By the way, many folks have not talked about this yet, a lot of those issues are already dealt with through previous legislation called PROMESA.
Mulvaney was walking back comments Trump made on Tuesday when he spoke with Fox News' Geraldo Rivera that he would move to eliminate the island's debt. Meanwhile, federal officials are now concerned the damage from Hurricane Maria will lead to nationwide shortages of critical medicine and other supplies, since Puerto Rico is one of the world's biggest centers of pharmaceutical manufacturing. We'll have more on Puerto Rico with Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez of New York, originally born in Puerto Rico, right where Hurricane Maria made landfall just over 2 weeks ago. President Trump traveled to Las Vegas and met with victims of Sunday night's mass shooting in which Stephen Paddock, a 64-year-old white man, killed 59 people, including himself, and injured nearly 500 people. More than 120 are still hospitalized. On Wednesday, the FBI questioned his girlfriend, Mary Lou Danley, who returned from her trip to visit family in the Philippines to meet with FBI agents. She said she had no prior knowledge of Paddock's plans to open fire from the 32nd floor of his Mandalay Bay Casino hotel suite onto more than 20,000 concert-goers below. More detail also emerged Wednesday about how Paddock had been stockpiling firearms, including buying 33 weapons in the past year alone from Nevada, Utah, California, and Texas. Authorities also say Paddock bought at least 12 devices known as bump stocks that allow semi-automatic rifles to act like machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute. Some Republican lawmakers said Wednesday they'd be open to legislation to ban the sale of bump stocks. In Nevada, even some gun range owners are speaking out against the lax gun laws that allow people to purchase bump stocks and high-capacity magazines. This is gun range owner Genghis Cohen.
There's absolutely no reason for an average citizen who wants to have a gun to have a 100-round magazine. Okay? There is no reason for them to be able to buy accessories for their gun, which makes the gun almost fully automatic. There's just no reason for it.
In news from Washington, the head of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee Wednesday said the committee's concluded Russia interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Senate Intelligence Committee Chair Richard Burr also said the committee's still examining whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia.
The issue of collusion is still open, that we continue to investigate both intelligence and witnesses, and that we're not in a position where we will come to any type of temporary finding on that until we've completed the process.
CNN is reporting a number of Russian-linked Facebook ads seeking to polarize the U.S. electorate, specifically targeted Michigan and Wisconsin, two states crucial to Trump's victory in November. The ads focused on issues such as gun rights, immigration, LGBTQ rights, and racial justice protests like Black Lives Matter. The NAACP issued a press release saying, quote, the utilization of Facebook for propaganda promoting disingenuous portrayals of the African-American community or alleged election manipulation by foreign nations is both disturbing and reprehensible, unquote. A new investigation has revealed President Trump's adult children, Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump Jr., were nearly charged with felony fraud in 2012 for lying to people interested in buying apartments in Trump's Soho, the hotel and condo development in downtown Manhattan. The near-criminal prosecution was revealed in an article jointly published by The New Yorker, ProPublica, and WNYC. The article also reveals the case was dropped by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office only after Trump's personal attorney, Mark Kasowitz, visited Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance Jr. in 2012, only months after Kasowitz donated $25,000 to Vance's re-election campaign. While Vance returned that $25,000 donation ahead of his meeting with Kasowitz, Vance went on to overrule his own prosecutors and instruct them to drop the case against Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr. 6 months later, Vance received a $50,000 donation from Kasowitz and his friends. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson held a hastily called news conference Wednesday in which he denied he's considered resigning over conflicts with President Trump.
The Vice President has never had to persuade me to remain as Secretary of State because I have never considered leaving this post. While I'm new to Washington, I have learned that there are some who try to sow dissension to advance their own agenda by tearing others apart in an effort to undermine President Trump's own agenda. I do not, and I will not operate that way. And the same applies to everyone on my team here at the State Department.
NBC News has reported Tillerson was on the verge of resigning last summer and that he called Trump a moron during a meeting at the Pentagon with cabinet officials and members of Trump's national security team in July. President Trump lashed out at NBC over the report, tweeting Wednesday, quote, NBC News is fake news and more dishonest than even CNN. They're a disgrace to good reporting. No wonder their news ratings are way down, unquote. In international news, the U.S.-backed Iraqi military says it seized control of the northern Iraqi town of Hawija from ISIS. Hawija is home to tens of thousands of people and has been occupied by ISIS since 2014. It was one of the last ISIS-controlled territories in Iraq. The Egyptian government has launched a wide-scale crackdown against the LGBT community, arresting at least 34 people. The crackdown began when Egyptian authorities arrested a 22-year-old law student and 6 others for waving a rainbow flag during a concert in Cairo of the internationally renowned Lebanese band Mashru Leila, whose lead singer is openly gay. The New York Times reports Egyptian prosecutors say many of the arrests were made after authorities entrapped gay and trans individuals on social media or dating apps. Amnesty International says Egypt has carried out at least 10 torturous, forced anal examinations against those arrested during the crackdown. In Sweden, prosecutors have convicted a Syrian soldier of committing a war crime, marking the first war crimes conviction of a member of the Syrian military since the beginning of the ongoing war. Mohammed Abdullah has been living in Sweden for 3 years, the former soldier. The landmark conviction came after Syrian refugees in Sweden identified him and connected him to a photo he had posted on Facebook showing him smiling while standing over a pile of bloody corpses with his boot on one of the bodies. After years of pressure by the Syrian refugees, Abdullah was convicted in Swedish court of, quote, violating human dignity and has been sentenced to 8 months in prison. The Israeli military has forcibly sealed off the Israeli-occupied West Bank and besieged Gaza Strip for the next 11 days amidst the Jewish harvest holiday of Sukkot. Human rights groups say the border closures are illegal under international law. It prevents tens of thousands of Palestinians from getting to their jobs inside Israel. This comes as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced plans to expand a Jewish-only settlement in the West Bank, promising a development boom. These settlements are also illegal under international law. In Bangladesh, authorities have destroyed nearly 24 boats that are used to ferry Rohingyas fleeing the Burmese military's ethnic cleansing campaign. More than 500,000 Rohingyas have fled to Bangladesh amidst the violent crackdown. In Britain, the Oxford City Council has voted to strip Burma's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, of her Freedom of Oxford Award over the violence. Aung San Suu Kyi studied in Oxford in the 60s and met her husband there. Thousands have also called for her to be stripped of her Nobel Peace Prize. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the House has passed a bill that would make abortions illegal after 20 weeks, except when the life of the mother is at risk or pregnancy was a result of rape or incest. Women's health advocates say the legislation is unconstitutional. The White House supports the extreme anti-choice bill, but it's likely to face opposition in the Senate. In St. Louis, Missouri, massive protests continue over the acquittal of white former police officer Jason Stockley for the murder of 24-year-old African-American Anthony Lamar Smith. Police arrested more than 140 people overnight on Tuesday as protesters blocked traffic on Interstate 64. More than 300 people have been arrested since the protests erupted nearly 3 weeks ago. Among those arrested on Tuesday were 2 journalists with the news outlet The Young Turks. And prisoner rights advocate John Thompson has died at the age of 55. Thompson was a former death row prisoner who was exonerated after it was revealed that the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office had suppressed evidence of his innocence. After winning his release in 2003, Thompson became a leading organizer against prosecutorial abuse. He also founded the organization Resurrection After Exoneration to support former prisoners' reentry into the free world. This is John Thompson speaking in 2013.
I spent 18 years of my life in prison. 14 of them was on death row. While on death row, I received 7 execution dates. I also watched 12 men be executed, leave off my tier to the death house, never return. Cruel and unusual punishment start there. You know, to watch a man that claimed to be innocent walk away, claiming his innocence all the way, and then you read it in the newspaper, or you know he don't return back to the tier because he had been executed.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The head of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee announced Wednesday it's reached the conclusion that Russia interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. This comes as CNN reports a number of Russian-linked Facebook ads specifically targeted Michigan and Wisconsin, 2 states crucial to Trump's victory in November. Republican Senator Richard Burr said his committee was still examining evidence to determine if there was any collusion between Moscow and the Trump campaign.
Any determination on collusion or Russia's preferences. If we used solely the social media advertising that we have seen, there's no way that you can look at that and say that that was to help the right side of the ideological chart and not the left, or vice versa. They were indiscriminate.
President Trump has called allegations of campaign collusion with Russia a hoax. Meanwhile, the Justice Department is pursuing a separate probe under Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Well, for more on Russia and Trump, we recently spoke with award-winning Russian-American author and journalist Masha Gessen. Her new book is titled The Future is History: How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, and has just been shortlisted for the National Book Award. It looks at why democracy failed in Putin's Russia and how the country descended descended into a more virulent and invincible strain of autocracy, all in the space of a generation.
Masha Gessen's book is a warning to the United States today. In many of her articles, she points to the similarities between Trump and Putin and has repeatedly warned of the threat of autocracy under a Trump presidency. 2 days after Trump's stunning electoral victory, she wrote an article for the New York Review of Books headlined "Autocracy: Rules for Survival," which was widely circulated on social media, received over 1 million views. Masha Gessen is a visiting professor at Amherst College, a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and the New York Times. Her previous books include the bestseller The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. We spoke with her last week and started by asking her about this viral story she wrote, "Autocracy: Rules for Survival."
So the way that piece came about, actually, was that on election night, like most people, I was at a horrible party, a party that began well and ended horribly. And by the time I got home, I got several notes from people I knew, close friends and not so close friends, sort of saying, "What do we do now?" As though I were some sort of guru on looming disasters. And I thought there was a point to that, because even though I don't think that Trump and Putin are that similar, right, they have major points of similarity because they perceive power in the same way and because they perceive politics in very much the same way. Even though they don't have, they're very different men, there's something that I have learned over 20 years of covering Putin and 20 years, even more importantly, of living, in a disintegrating democracy that I thought I could probably help convey to my friends and to other people. So that was sort of the genesis of that piece. I think that things have gone pretty much as badly as I had expected. When I was asked what my greatest fear was, I said my greatest fear was a nuclear holocaust, which seemed ridiculous, a little less than a year ago, and we are on the brink of that, actually, and we have been for weeks, right? Which is something that we try not to talk about, because how do you talk about that? Right? I think that certainly one of the 6 rules for autocracy was institutions will not save you. And the reason that I considered it necessary to write that was because at the time, if you remember, a lot of people were saying, well, yes, Trump is the kind of politician who has never been president in this country, but institutions of our democracy are so strong that he's not going to be able to do that much damage. And my sense was that a lot of what people thought of as institutions were actually norms and habits and customs. But even formal institutions are actually not designed to stand up to somebody who is dealing with them in bad faith. And that's what we have observed. And we have observed institutions failing to keep a check on Trump in many ways.
And what are some of the steps that you think, apart from the impact on institutions or together with that, what are the steps that Trump has taken that bear the mark of autocratic rule? Well,
he governs by gesture. Right. And this is something that has been very difficult for us, I think, to assimilate, because people who are in the business of analyzing politics and understanding politics think about politics as policy and strategy and sort of a story that has a future, right? And Trump doesn't think of politics that way at all. He thinks of effective gestures. He thinks of demonstrating his power, right? So a good example is the tweet about banning transgender people in the military, right? Sort of the scramble to try to understand what had just happened was fascinating to me, because one of the first things that people reacted by saying was, well, it's a tweet, right? It's not an executive order. Well, he is the commander-in-chief. He can tweet his policy if he wants to. Right? To him, that's the most effective gesture. Then the second order of interpretation was, well, what does it mean? What is he trying to accomplish? He's not trying to accomplish anything except demonstrate his power. And I think also instinctively sort of keep us on our toes, right? The less predictable his behavior, the more sort of it's oriented toward demonstrating raw power, the more he accomplishes what he intuitively wants to accomplish, which is establish power.
One of the things that you say, and you've said several times in your articles, I mean, you said just now that obviously Trump and Putin are not identical, but they do share much in common. And in fact, in one of your pieces, you suggested that Trump, in certain ways, may actually be worse. You say, and let me quote you, where Putin's unpredictable persona is a carefully cultivated one, Trump has given no evidence that his madman act is an act. So could you elaborate on that?
Right. So for many years, Putin established what he thinks of as power, which is basically being feared, by demonstrating to other world leaders that he will stop at nothing. Right? So in that sense, for example, his invasion of Ukraine, which again, a lot of people have tried to interpret in sort of conventional strategic terms, you know, Russia is interested in Ukraine for this, that, or another reason, and that doesn't hold up because it's a losing war, it's an extremely expensive war, it's an extraordinarily expensive and pointless occupation in Crimea. But it does something very important, and it continues to do it as long as Putin stays in Ukraine, which is that it shows that Putin will do the inconceivable, right? He will do things that, even as he is doing them, continue to be absolutely shocking, so shocking that we can't really imagine that. And that is a message that he's sending both to his people in Russia and to world leaders, right? And so. Sort of the conventional wisdom on Russia has consistently, under Putin in the West, moved toward the containment and just, you know, let's not poke the Russian bear because the Russian bear will stop at nothing, right? And Putin does think that that's power. As long as Russia is feared in the world, then he has established Russia as a great world, reestablished Russia as a great world power. So now we have Trump, who keeps doing shocking things on the world stage, like threatening to obliterate North Korea, right? Which is just as much, it seems as much of a madman act as what Putin has done. And basically has one-upped Putin's game, except that if for Putin it's at least partly strategic, right? Not that I think he has any sort of moral limitations on his actions, but to him, doing the unimaginable is always a power play. I think for Trump, nothing is really unimaginable. I mean, he perceives the world in exactly the terms that he puts out in his tweets. He thinks that standing up to North Korea is probably equal to threatening it with obliteration, and you know, we're lucky if it continues to be just a threat.
I wanted to go to then the normalizing of Trump. You've got Trump himself and his statements, and something that you continually talk about is the very serious issue of normalization. Now, the media in the United States has become more oppositional than usual, to say the least, or maybe for the first time oppositional when it comes to Trump, because he directly called them out. He talks about the failing New York Times, fake news, CNN, and he calls reporters by name. So they are defending themselves, and they tend to sound a little like Democracy Now! You know, independent media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society, they say. Mm-hmm. But that's true on a number of issues, like they're talking about him being a liar. They're willing to say that. Interestingly, they weren't quite willing to say that George Bush was a liar when it came to weapons of mass destruction. But I wanted to go to the areas where there isn't that kind of questioning. And that is, on the one hand, climate change. When it comes to the nonstop coverage of hurricanes, almost no mention of climate change, not just in Fox, but in MSNBC and CNN. And then the issue of war and bombing. The night that the United States bombed that Syrian airfield, when a number of reporters and commentators said, now Trump has become president, or the day in Afghanistan he dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb in the history of the world, the Moab, the mother of all bombs. But let's go back to Syria. Now, we're not going to Fox, we're going to MSNBC, when anchor Brian Williams referred to the Pentagon video of the U.S. missiles fired at Syria, referred to it as beautiful 3 times in 30 seconds.
We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons." And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield. What did they hit?
Can you hear Leonard Cohen rolling over in his grave? Well, that was MSNBC's Brian Williams. And this is CNN's Fareed Zakaria speaking on New Day Friday morning of that week.
I think Donald Trump became president of the United States. I think this was actually a big moment because candidate Trump had said that he would never get involved in the Syrian civil war. He told President Obama, you cannot do this without the authorization of Congress. He seemed unconcerned with global norms. President Trump recognized that the president of the United States does have to act to enforce international norms, does have to have this broader moral and political purpose.
So that was CNN's Fareed Zakaria, and before that, Brian Williams. Masha Gessen.
So, you know, the thing about normalization is that, in a way, it's inevitable, because this is the reality that we're living in, right? This is the President of the United States. And to entirely refuse to normalize him would be to deny that reality. And I think that's the problem that faces a lot of journalists, which is, how do you continue to do your job? How do you continue to treat this, your job, seriously, if, you know, if we have a deranged clown for a president? And so the moment that he starts acting a little bit less like a deranged clown, the moment that he does something like, you know, lob 59 missiles at Syria, which is more normal in terms of the presidency than tweeting, right, about Arnold Schwarzenegger's ratings on The Apprentice.
Which doesn't make it right.
It doesn't make it right, but it is closer
to what presidents do.
To what we assume presidents do, or at least the president of this country. And, you know, the spectacle of this country going to war is more. So we're more accustomed to it, and journalists are more accustomed to covering that than they are to covering presidents acting like small children throwing a tantrum on Twitter. And so at that moment, you know, what Fareed Zakaria says, I think, or what Brian Williams is doing is expressing his own relief at feeling for at least 7 minutes like he can comprehend the reality that he's called upon to interpret.
But isn't there also an element here of the major problem for establishment journalists, especially when it comes to war? And it's not only around Trump, it's just that they didn't respond to Trump any differently, that they circle the wagons around the White House when it comes to war.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's... but that, you know, that is normal. That is normal in American journalism. This is actually not new to us, right? What's new is plugging Trump into that role. And the thing is, I think, you know, in his sort of television feedback loop, he's learning some important lessons. He looks his best when he goes to war. You know, the way that the picture on television changed from the day before missiles were fired at Syria to the day they were fired was absolutely extraordinary. You know, the day before there were, in fact, the day before I was at Lincoln Center, New York, during an interview with Nikki Haley, who was literally laughed off the stage. And then the following day, there she was on television, you know, being interviewed one-on-one, and suddenly, you know, sounding like a stateswoman, right? And there was a lot of one-on-one with Trump officials that day, and especially with Nikki Haley, which there hadn't been for weeks leading up to it. You know, there had been talking heads with usually one Trump supporter and 3 or 4 more intelligent people. And all of that was like gone from the picture the moment missiles were fired at Syria. And that I think is a very good lesson for him and what looks good.
Well, I mean, apart from that, you've also talked about the way in which the media has responded to his by now extremely well-documented litany of lies. You point in particular, and it's not the only example, of NPR not calling his lies misstatements. So could you talk about what the danger of that is, or what you think the danger of that is?
So I think this is one of the ways in which we can really get a chance to sort of re-examine American journalistic practices and assumptions behind some American journalism, which is that it always exists sort of out of time and out of place, right? It's the view from nowhere, which is a thing in journalism, right? In American journalism, translates into pretending that we don't know what came yesterday and we have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. How that relates to the idea of not calling his lies lies is that, the NPR explains that in order to call something, that a lie is an intentional fiction, right? And since NPR doesn't have a direct line to Trump's soul, they don't know whether he actually intends to mislead us or whether he accidentally makes a mistake.
So, for example, when he talks about his crowd size, that it was larger than President Obama's, and you see the pictures 1.8 million, and his is a tenth of the size, and he says his was larger.
So, because NPR doesn't have a direct line to, his brain, they don't know how he's perceiving the picture. Maybe he's just seeing more people in that picture. Look, I mean, it's absurd, right? But I think it communicates something very important, which is that basically NPR says we're going to insist that every time it happens, it's like it's never happened before. Because the only way that you can claim that he has perhaps accidentally misstated facts is if you don't remember that he did the exact same thing 5 minutes ago and 10 minutes ago and 10 days ago and 10 years ago, right? And that, that's a real sort of abdication of responsibility to engage with the reality that they're supposed to cover.
Award-winning author and journalist Masha Gessen, her new book, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. It was just shortlisted for the National Book Award. Back with her in a minute.
What do you want your world to look like? What do you want it to be? Do you know that the wall has two sides and nobody is free? Did your mama come from Mexico? Papa come from Palestine? Sneaking all through Syria, crossing all the borderlines. Let other people in. Listen to your women. Stop killing black children.
Make America Great Again by the Russian protest band Pussy Riot. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we continue our conversation with award-winning author, journalist Masha Gessen, author of The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia.
I asked Gessen how she thinks President Donald Trump is distorting language. One example she cites in her piece is on NATO, that Trump first said that NATO is obsolete and then later said it was no longer obsolete.
The way that he's mangling the English language is something that I think is so dangerous, and Americans are a little bit innocent to that danger. And this is where, oddly, having grown up in the Soviet Union and then having lived in Russia as a journalist for so many years, I'm extremely sensitive to what happens to language. And I've talked to Italian journalists about this. Italian journalists I mentioned because they lived through a much sort of milder form of what I observed in Russia. But they say that Berlusconi, over 20 years of his reign, did so much damage to the language that they're still recovering their ability to describe what they're dealing with, right? And so Trump does two things. He uses words to mean their opposite, right? So when he does things like, he calls the Russia investigation a witch hunt, right? It's the opposite. He uses the phrase witch hunt to mean its opposite in several ways. And the most important of them is to reverse the relationship of power, right? I mean, a witch hunt, by definition, used to be something that people with power could perpetrate upon people who didn't have power, right? Here's the most powerful man in the world saying that he's the victim of a witch hunt. But he also just uses words to mean nothing. Like, a thing cannot be first obsolete and then no longer obsolete, right? That reverses sort of our understanding of time and words. And both these are distinct kinds of damage to language, but they make our shared reality mushy, right? Because how do you use terms that no longer mean anything or have come to mean their opposite, which also is a way of meaning nothing, right? And as a journalist, I've worked in a language that has been violated in similar ways. First, by the Soviet regime using words to mean their opposite, where literally freedom was the word freedom was used to mean unfreedom, and the word democracy was used to mean tyranny. And then under Putin, I observed words being used in very much the way that Trump uses them, just to mean nothing, right? Just to create a kind of cacophony in which you never can get a grasp of what's going on. And Trump is doing both, and that's going to make our recovery from Trump, which inevitably will come, that much more difficult.
I wanted to ask you about Trump's attraction for Putin, why you think that is, and if Putin has the same feelings about Trump.
So I think Trump's attraction for Putin, again, people have tried to figure out, what does Putin have on Trump that Trump keeps praising him. But I think the Yale historian Timothy Snyder put it best in an early piece for the New York Review of Books, that Putin is the dictator that Trump plays on TV. Trump really wants to be Putin. He thinks that that's what power looks like. He thinks that politics is about exercising raw power. He thinks that 86% popularity is a sign of extreme popularity and extreme effectiveness.
86% popularity. That's what Putin has.
That's what Putin has. That's what Putin has, and that is a totalitarian level number, right? That's when you're no longer talking about public opinion, because there is no public and there is no opinion, right? You're just taking the temperature sort of totalitarianism in the country, and it's pretty damn high. And that's what Trump sort of instinctively aspires to. The feeling is not mutual. Putin thinks that Trump is a clown. He's made that abundantly clear.
How?
Well, when early on, remember, Trump used to tell us that Putin called him brilliant. And what Putin actually said was that Trump was colorful. The word colorful in Russian can also be translated to English as bright, right? So someone must have translated for Trump as bright.
What's the word?
The word is яркий. So it's actually, the literal translation would be vivid, but you don't call a person vivid, right? You could either translate it as colorful or as bright, right? But the vernacular would actually be colorful. It wouldn't be bright. So someone must have translated for Trump as bright, and then Trump inflated bright to brilliant. So Fareed Zakaria, who comes up for the second time today, during an interview in Moscow in September of 2016, asked Putin, you call Trump brilliant. Why did you do that? And Putin, you could just see how thrilled he was, because very much like Trump, he loves it when journalists are wrong. And so he says, well, I never said that. Why do you believe things you hear? If you go back to what I said, I called him colorful. Well, he's colorful, isn't he? And that, that just sums up his attitude toward Trump. Every comment he's made since, and sort of the way that Russian television has treated Trump. It either portrays Trump as the man who affirms Putin's power, because, of course, Russia is very happy with the narrative that Russia elected the American president, right? Or they treat Trump as a bumbling idiot who can't get anything right, including his relationship with Russia, which, for all the Russia conspiracy, the relationship between the United States and Russia has never been worse. I mean, it hasn't been worse since the end of World War II. Right? We are deep into the territory of mutual diplomatic expulsions. At this point, the American embassy in Moscow and St. Peter and the consulate in St. Petersburg have been forced to stop issuing visas to Russian citizens because they are so poorly staffed that they actually can't process visas. We're on the brink of actually losing diplomatic relations altogether.
Masha, you are the author of The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. You've been fiercely critical of Russia. You're fiercely critical of the Trump administration. But you're also fiercely critical of the story that has predominated now of Russia's interference with the U.S. election that ended in the victory of Trump. Why?
Well, because, I just need more things to be fiercely critical of, obviously. But I think, and this is a word that also has almost lost its meaning because we use it so much. In a way, it's a distraction, right? And this is a very difficult point to try to convey, right? That I think that conspiracy thinking is really dangerous to culture and to political culture, and it's very hard to stay away from conspiracy thinking when there may have been a conspiracy. Right? We don't know if there was a conspiracy, but even if there was, we should do our best to try not to engage in conspiracy thinking for a couple of reasons. One is that it lends itself to fantasy. It lends itself to this idea that once we discover that Trump colluded with the Russians, that will magically get rid of Trump. That's not going to happen for two reasons. One is that it's extremely unlikely that the investigation, when it's over, and it's going to drag on for a long time, but it's extremely unlikely that it's going to produce the kind of solid evidence of collusion that that could be used as a legal basis for impeachment. But even more important, there's not going to be any impeachment as long as Republicans are in power in both houses of Congress. Right? So there isn't a direct line from any kind of conclusions from the Russia investigation to getting rid of Trump. But more important, it creates this fantasy that we can find a reasonable explanation for the election of Trump that will somehow let us out of this national nightmare. And the national nightmare is that Americans elected Trump, and he's president. Russians didn't elect Trump. Even if there was collusion, even if every hypothesis that is at play in the Russian investigation is proved, still Americans elected Trump, and he is president. And he's doing incredible damage to this country, while so much of the media is obsessed with proving the Russia story. And every American citizen has limited bandwidth, even if the internet has unlimited bandwidth. And so the more we engage with the Russia story, the less we engage with our lived reality of destruction of democracy in this country.
Well, in that sense, as you say in your piece, in one of your pieces, this whole investigation into Russia is actually helping Trump and the media's obsession with it. Could you talk about the role of the intelligence community in media reporting on Russia?
So I think this is one of the most disturbing things about especially the early coverage of the Russia theory, right? Which was that all of the early coverage was driven by leaks from the intelligence community. Now, the problem with leaks from the intelligence community, the problems are obvious, right? One is that they can't be corroborated. Two is that your sources control the timing and sort of the dosage of the leaks. So basically, journalists become mouthpieces for people in the intelligence community who may or may not be pursuing their own goals that have nothing to do with informing the public. Their job is not to inform the public, right? That's the media's job. But a close enough relationship gets the media out of the business of informing the public and into the business of being mouthpieces for the intelligence community. And of course, we should be highly skeptical of anything that comes from the intelligence community based on the experience that American media have had recently, during the careers of many of the people who are covering the leaks now, of leaks being used to mislead the American public in fundamental ways.
Well, you said earlier, Masha, that one of the problems with this obsession with the Russia investigation is that it prevents us from thinking about why Americans elected Trump. Now, in one of your pieces, you talked about the effects, the kind of looking at the longer view, the effects of 9/11 and the concentration of power in the executive branch. Can you say what you think some of the historical, although not that long ago, reasons are that Trump was elected?
So that was a piece that I wrote when I was asked to write about the looming Reichstag fire. If you remember, I think this trope has sort of faded a little bit. But early on in the Trump presidency, a lot of people were saying, oh, he's going to use an event to consolidate power, to create a state of exception. Right? And that event is going to be like a terrorist attack. And of course, the terrorist attack is inevitable. It's just a question of how Trump is going to use it. My argument is basically that our Reichstag fire And the Reichstag fire, as I'm sure you know, is in 1934, the Reichstag, the Parliament building in Berlin, burned, and Hitler, who had just recently been appointed chancellor, used it as a pretext for restricting political freedoms in really profound ways, in ways that, to create a state of exception, what his favorite legal theorist, Carl Schmitt, called it a state of exception, which is when the sovereign claims extraordinary power. Right? Well, I think that has all happened in this country, and it happened in the wake of September 11th. The state of emergency that went into effect 3 days after September 11th has never been lifted. It was renewed by President Obama every September for 7 years of his presidency, the 7 Septembers that he was president. We continue to be in the state of emergency. The War Powers Act passed with one dissenting vote 3 days after September 11th, continues to be in effect and has been used by President Obama and now by President Trump. And there's also been a 16-year run of increasing concentration of power in the executive branch. Under George W. Bush, basically in the interest of shoring up more military and surveillance power. Under President Obama, for some of the same and some other reasons, having to do with Congress that was intent on paralyzing him. But basically, I think that chain of events did a lot to create the possibility of Trump, to create the very possibility of a politician who could run for autocrat in this country and get elected.
Award-winning author and journalist Masha Gessen. Her new book is The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. It's been shortlisted for the National Book Award. When we come back, Congressmember Nydia Velázquez has just returned from Puerto Rico. Stay with us.
Because the man in the tinfoil hat is sitting on the throne tonight. Kind of feels like a coup d'etat, but it's gonna be great, tremendous, amazing, and all that. 'Cause the man in the tinfoil hat is bleeding like a teenage girl.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, the strongest storm to hit the island in nearly a century. More than 2 weeks later, more than 90% of its 3.5 million residents remain without electricity, running water, and adequate food. After President Trump visited Puerto Rico on Tuesday, he told Fox News his administration would help Puerto Rico wipe out its $73 billion debt to help it recover from the extensive damage caused by Hurricane Maria.
Well, we're going to work something out. We have to look at their whole debt structure. You know, they owe a lot of money to your friends on Wall Street, and we're going to have to wipe that out. That's going to have to be, you know, you can say goodbye to that. I don't know if it's Goldman Sachs, but whoever it is, you can wave goodbye to that. We have to do something about, because the debt was massive on the island.
Trump's comments Tuesday night shook financial markets. On Wednesday morning, White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney walked back the remarks, saying they should not be taken word for word.
Dealing with the challenges that Puerto Rico had. The island is at least $72 billion in debt, 120 if you go by other counts, before the storm. We are going to focus our attention right now on rebuilding the island, repairing the island, making sure everybody is safe, and that we get through this difficult times. We are not going to deal right now with those fundamental difficulties that Puerto Rico had before the storm. By the way, many folks have not talked about this yet, a lot of those issues are already dealt with through previous legislation called PROMESA.
This comes after Trump tweeted last month that, quote, Puerto Rico, which was already suffering from broken infrastructure and massive debt, is in deep trouble with, quote, billions of dollars owed to Wall Street and the banks, which sadly must be dealt with. For more, we go to Capitol Hill, where we're joined by Congressmember Nydia Velázquez, who comes from New York but was born in Puerto Rico, actually right where Hurricane Maria made landfall. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Congressmember. Can you respond respond to this issue of the debt, why it is so significant. You went to Puerto Rico right after the storm hit, well before President Trump. You went with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Talk about what you say needs to happen now.
What we need to do is to get the federal government to provide the resources that we need in order to rebuild Puerto Rico, and that should be the focus. The reality is Puerto Rico is running out of cash, have no liquidity, and this is not the time to deal with the public debt. You know, we have PROMESA, an oversight board that sent a letter to the president asking for working with the administration to get an infusion of cash, because otherwise the government will not be able to function. So that should be the primary focus, to make sure that Puerto Rico has liquidity, that Puerto Rico can have the safety and security that is needed, and also provide access to health care, to the health services that are so important, particularly after the aftermath of this hurricane.
The Jones Act, are you calling for an extension? There was a waiver for 10 days after enormous outcry that Texas and Florida had gotten it, but Puerto Rico hadn't. Explain its significance and what you're demanding now. Why is the Jones Act so important, what it is?
It is important because it's not only about putting together a relief effort and trying to, you know, remove the debris and do all the cleanup that needs to happen. But if we want to put Puerto Rico back on track in terms of economic recovery, the Jones Act really is an obstacle. It really hinders the ability of transporting all the supplies and all the materials that we need, including oil and fuel. And not only that, but also it makes it more expensive. So what I'm asking is for a waiver of at least 1 year. But I'm working with other members to introduce legislation that will call for a 5 years waiver, so that Puerto Rico, it becomes a tool of economic development for Puerto Rico.
And Congressmember Velasquez, you went to Puerto Rico very soon after Hurricane Maria made landfall. Can you tell us what you saw there?
I saw what President Donald Trump didn't see. I saw the destruction, devastation, and the desperation of the people in Puerto Rico. 90%, still today, 95% of the people in Puerto Rico out of 100 do not have electricity, drinking water, medicines, hospitals. They don't have power. And as we saw yesterday or the day before, the day before, the governor, right after the president left the island, said that the toll of death increase has risen from 16 to 34. And if you read the papers today, all the accounts are telling us that doctors in Puerto Rico are very concerned. Many people could be exposed to many illnesses because of polluted water, because of the lack of medicine, because of the lack of medical supplies.
Congressmember Velasquez, your assessment of the Trump administration and what it's doing in Puerto Rico. Trump goes down, to say the least, quite late, and he's hurling these rolls of paper towels at people. He attacks the San Juan mayor, Carmen Yulín Cruz, and talks about Puerto Ricans as wanting everything done for them. Your thoughts?
It is quite so depressing, frustrating. Watching the images coming out of that event made me angry. I believe that it was an insult and a lack of respect to the people of Puerto Rico, fellow citizens who were expecting from the president to go there, console, comfort, gave assurances that the federal government will be there, that he understood the pain, but that the important message was we're going to be here all the way until Puerto Rico is rebuilt. Instead, he was talking about the cost to the federal budget. How could you, when people are dying, when people are suffering, raise such issues that you didn't raise when you went to Texas and Florida? You know, these are American citizens. These are fellow citizens. So I was quite angry that he went to a Guaynabo suburb, very wealthy part of Puerto Rico, and I was expecting for him to really grasp the severity of the crisis by going into the most isolated areas, the most devastated areas, so that he will be able to come back and then put forward a relief recovery package that makes sense based on the real needs of the people of Puerto Rico.
Would you call it racism?
I do not want to. I think that what it shows is how out of touch this president and this administration is right now on the damage that was caused in Puerto Rico, the destruction. You know, I don't know if it's racism or ignorance, but I hope that next week we're going to be passing a short-term relief package, and after that we need to work on a robust long-term package that would include the resources for Puerto Rico to be able to rebuild.
And Congressmember Velasquez, do you think that the debt should be forgiven? And if so, what do you think the effect would be on the reconstruction effort?
Well, the president made such a statement. He didn't discuss how he will achieve that. The mechanics, we don't know, but I will say this to you. Forget about public debt right now. The most important aspect and commitment from my end is to fight to get the resources that we need. If we don't make Puerto Rico whole, you're going to see a massive migration of people coming into the United States, and hedge funds or others who are owned money, they need to forget that Puerto Rico will be able to pay anything. If anything, we have to take care of retirees in Puerto Rico and the pension liabilities. I think that
should the debt be forgiven?
If there is a way, in terms of the authority of the federal government, yes, I will support it.
I wanted to ask you very quickly about DACA. You represent many people from Puerto Rico. Again, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, 3.5 million American citizens. But there are many undocumented people in New York. And we want to just ask about what should happen. Today is the deadline for them to apply for renewals of their DACA status under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Immigration Plan, which shields 800,000 young people from deportation. What is Congress doing on this day?
Well, as you know, the Democrats filed a discharge petition that will require 218 signatures. We are not there yet. We got all the Democrats to sign into that discharge. We also introduced legislation, Lucille Roybal Allard, the DREAM Act. We are at a 202 or 200. So we are working very hard, reaching out to moderate Republicans. I'm reaching out to some of my colleagues in New Jersey to see if we could get the 218 votes that we need in order to bring a bill to the floor. In the meantime, we have met with the administration. There has been commitments that they will not proceed to deport the Dreamers.
We're going to have to leave it there. Congressmember Nydia Velasquez, thanks so much for being with us. New York Congress member born in Puerto Rico. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.